I'm here with Matt Knittel. He is the director of the Independent Fiscal Office. Director Knittel, Governor Wolf recently signed a budget that will take Pennsylvania through the next 5 months. How did COVID-19 and Pennsylvania's economy impact or have any effect on what that budget was this year?
Well, because I'd say it had a very dramatic effect both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. And as you know, a budget was passed for a good part of the budget for 5 months, and education was extended out the whole year. But right now, the most dramatic effect that we're seeing is clearly on the revenues and the labor market, the jobs. So we saw a very large reduction in jobs in the month of April. The May jobs report is going to come out in about a week. Much like the US, we think there might be a little improvement, but we'll have to wait and see what the data show.
And looking ahead, there's probably going to be another budget session at the end of this year. What kind of influences will COVID-19 still have on a budget process for Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so right now I think we have I'd say a decent handle on the immediate impact of COVID-19 on the revenues that we're seeing. So again, we thought about 1 million jobs were lost in the month of April. Now the real question is what does the recovery look like? How quickly would it occur? Will it be a U-shaped recovery or a V-shaped recovery? And heading into next year, will we get most of these jobs back? Our forecast right now, we don't think we will. We think there's a kind of a hangover, if you will, going into next year. And we do think a lot of these jobs that we've lost due to COVID-19, that we won't recover from them for many years.
So what type of recovery do you potentially see Pennsylvania going through?
Well, I'd characterize the Independent Fiscal Office, my office, as cautiously optimistic. So we think there will be a fairly rapid recovery. I think we're starting to see some signs of that already in the sales there. They're beginning to pick up already. Withholding, which is our labor market, they're holding up pretty well. So we have a fairly, I'd call it more of a V-shaped recovery, that we're bouncing back in the third and fourth quarters of this year. And heading into the first and second quarters of next year, we have our recovery largely built in.
Now, earlier you mentioned that the COVID-19 has had an effect on Pennsylvania's revenues. What kind of effects has your office seen?
Well, it's really across the board for all of our revenue sources, but there's a few in particular that you can see a very dramatic impact. Of course, sales taxes, first and foremost. We saw that very dramatically in our what we call our motor vehicle sales taxes on car sales, because the dealerships were closed. That's starting to pick up now. Overall sales taxes, if we hold out motor vehicles, they were down about 20% year over year for the month of May, which isn't that bad given that we had roughly 1 million job layoffs, which is almost 20% of about 17% of all jobs in Pennsylvania. So overall, I'd say that sales taxes and income taxes were the main ones affected. Our realty transfer taxes, which is based on home sales, were also affected. But I will also say that they're holding up generally better than I would have thought. So they're taking dramatic hits, but not as bad as I would have thought a month ago.
Now, some of our revenues that may normally have counted for the year 2020 are now being pushed back into the next year, 2021. Why is that, and what impacts will that have on the revenues for this year and for next year?
Sure. So, yeah, we had a number of, we call them delayed due dates, in particular for personal income tax. The payments that are usually due in April were pushed off to next year. And even for corporate income taxes, we had some payments that are pushed off to next year as well. And that was to provide, I would say, relief in the form of immediate cash flow. So in particular, a lot of businesses, small businesses, due to the lack of sales, they had to conserve their cash flow. And so we're pushing these payments off for 3 or 4 months. And my office thought about $2 billion of payments were going to get pushed out of this fiscal year into next fiscal year. So that's just a timing issue. We should get most of those monies just 3 or 4 months later.
Now, your office, the Independent Fiscal Office, has released a report last month about revenue estimates for the upcoming fiscal year. What did you and your office find?
Well, I think for this year, we have a projection of $31.8 billion, and heading into next year, it's closer to $36 billion. And one of the questions that we're always asked is, what's the shortfall in the revenues? What does that mean? How much would we have collected had it not been for COVID-19? And we did try to estimate that, and we did think that the overall impact of COVID-19 on general fund revenues was about $5 billion for this year and next. So that's how we would characterize the so-called shortfall, that if COVID-19 hadn't hit, we would have had $5 billion more of revenues.
And how do you calculate that shortfall? What goes into finding that number?
So what we need to do is, a technical term, we need to make a counterfactual forecast, which is, what would happen under normal conditions for this stage of the economic cycle. This is the 10th year, or we were in the 10th year of expansion. So growth was slowing down, but quite frankly, the Pennsylvania economy was doing quite well before this hit in January and February. The labor market was doing extraordinarily well. Even the housing market, the housing sales were strong. So what we do is carry out those growth rates out to this year and next, and then compare it to our revised forecast under COVID-19. And again, for both years, it's about a $5 billion shortfall.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there have been some job losses here in Pennsylvania. How much job loss have we seen, and how has that affected Pennsylvania's economy?
So the job losses, very broadly speaking, if we ignore independent contractors, people in the gig economy, we're looking about 6 million payroll jobs. So these are folks who have withholding and other type of taxes taken out of their paycheck. For the month of April, we had a reduction of 1 million payroll jobs out of 6 million. So 1 out of 6 job losses. And if you look across the detail, based on the data from the Department of Labor, there were some particular industries that were hit very hard, notably the retail sector, the restaurant sector was hit very hard, and even healthcare. So you had your primary care providers, even dentist offices that weren't operating. And one other notable industry that was hit was construction. But we are expecting construction to kind of bounce back here in the month of May and June.
Now, with many people experiencing job loss, something that they may apply for is unemployment compensation. Has that had any effect on Pennsylvania's revenues or the economy for this year?
Yes, we think it's having a very dramatic effect on our revenue collections, actually. Right now, about a little over 1 million Pennsylvania residents is receiving some form of unemployment compensation. And as you know, in addition to the normal unemployment compensation, they are receiving another $600 each and every week. They will receive those amounts through about the middle of July to the end of July. And we do think that's really providing a boost to our economy and to our sales tax collections in particular. So I think it's very dramatic. It's very notable.
Now, as a part of COVID-19 and our emergency declaration, Pennsylvania has been receiving federal money. How has that been affecting Pennsylvania as a whole, and how has that been affecting our economy and the revenues that we're seeing?
Yeah, I'd also say that there's a dramatic impact from the federal relief. And as you noted, it could take many forms. One way is through unemployment compensation. Another way is through these direct grants that come into the state, and then they're going out to local units or to nursing homes. There's also some federal tax cuts that are coming into play. So really the infusion of federal monies into the state it's really, for lack of a better term, I call it massive. It's very large. Wouldn't call it stimulative per se. What I would say, it's dramatically reducing the downturn that would have occurred without it. But they are having, I think, a dramatic effect and really providing an underpinning for the Pennsylvania economy.
As we've been working through COVID-19 and your office has been making reports about the revenues from the state, how have you seen those revenues change throughout this pandemic?
So what we saw through, again, the month of January and February, things were holding up well. The month of March, we just started to see a very minor impact, I would say. The revenues were, again, pretty good. And then in the month of April, we started to see the dramatic effects and heading into May as well. But again, I'd say probably April was the low point. Even in the month of May, we started to see some of our revenue sources start to snap back a bit. And I would put in there sales taxes and, again, realty transfer taxes, the housing market, and car sales. So the dealerships are starting to open up. So I do think we're seeing an improvement, real-time improvement in these revenue sources. And heading into the month of June, of course, we have all counties moving to yellow status. We have many of them moving to green status. So we do expect continued improvement through the months of June and July.
And one final question, what would you say the importance of these types of reports are, especially when we're in a time of pandemic and we're looking at how this is affecting our economy?
Yeah, I think these reports are very important because they're getting into the public debate and providing policymakers with real-time data about how we look on the overall situation. So what we want to avoid is being rushed into passing laws or making changes that in retrospect maybe weren't the best thing to do. And so that's why it's important to have these reports come out on a regular basis, to be updated in real time, so policymakers have a sense of what's happening and then can craft a policy that's effective.
Director Matt Knittel, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
After a great victory over Union forces in June 1863, Robert E. Lee marches his army to Pennsylvania. The advancing Confederates clash with General Meade's Union Army at Gettysburg, beginning the most famous battle of the Civil War. Explore our nation's past and the Gettysburg battlefield with the Gettysburg Collection. Become a member to stream the library online. Learn more at gettysburgcollection.com.
I'm here with Representative Josh Kail. He's a Republican representing Beaver and Washington counties. Representative Kail, can you talk about the situation with COVID-19 within your district?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. COVID-19 has had a big impact on our district. They're outside of one facility within our district. Beaver County and Washington County has done very well of flattening the curve, of making sure there's not a lot of spread within the community. However, there is a facility within my district that has 370 or so cases. And just to give you some perspective, Beaver County has about 600 cases right now, and 370 of them or so are coming from this one facility. The last I checked, we had, and this was a couple of days ago, we had, I believe it was 78 deaths, and something like 73 or 4 were from that one facility, the nursing home facility. So that facility tragically got hit very hard, and the National Guard did come in the beginning of May. We were asking for some help at the end of March, and it was a hard time for everybody across the state, but it was a disappointing situation, and I'm glad to see that the facility is coming back around as it relates to the health of their residents. But really, what we need to do, looking at that facility and what happened across the state, it wasn't just there. There was other places and nursing homes in different parts of the state that were also hit hard. We've got to be smart now. We know what this virus does and how it affects people and who it affects. And I think it's just imperative that we are prepared. It's imperative that we spend the resources to our most vulnerable members, particularly our seniors. And this is coming from a guy that I'm not a big believer in lots of spending, but I do think a priority of our Commonwealth and of the state government ought to be our senior care. And I think this showed that we have been lacking collectively. Governor, legislature, Republicans, Democrats, we've collectively been lacking and failing that system. And I think it's about time we make things right going forward.
How have you and your colleagues been working to help support the constituents in your district and to help support Pennsylvanians during this really difficult time?
Yeah, it's been remarkable. And this is my first term in office. And, the first year and a half or so, it was pretty standard, right? We had a budget, it was contentious, but we passed it the first year. We went through the process of just the passing bills, setting an agenda, and then COVID happened. At first, when COVID happened, the biggest concern right out of the gates was the business shutdown order. Once that happened, I believe it was March 19th was the date it went into effect, maybe the 18th, but somewhere in there. The next 10 or 15 days or so, I was on the phone constantly with small businesses asking questions. They can't get through to the administration. They applied for an exemption. Where's my exemption? I was contacting DCD to try and find out for my constituents what's going on with these exemptions, and just to get a picture of what's happening, what the decision-making process is, and just trying to be a bridge, from my constituents to Harrisburg, so that we can do it as effectively as possible for everybody. And then after that period, during that period, actually, another focus became PPE. I never heard of an N95 mask before this whole crisis. I've seen them, I know what they are, but the whole N95 mask and this, that, and what the other things that we're asking for, all of a sudden became really, really critical issues. And locally, a bunch of our construction companies, we have Shell locally building a massive manufacturing plant, and Bechtel is helping there, and they all pitched in. Our energy companies, Range Resources, Equitrans, EQT, they pitched in and they donated supplies to hospitals. And then getting into early April, it turned into an unemployment compensation system problem, where people said, hey, I filed back in the middle of March, haven't heard anything. And we, unfortunately, we actually still get some of those calls. And it took people months in some cases to get anything. And naturally, because of that, the next situation became the food banks. And so we were raising money for food banks in the middle of April and May, and just trying to help each other as much as we could within the community. And really, one of the things that I think we did collectively as representatives across the board, I think what we did well was letting people know where and how they could help. And because there's only so much we can do as representatives, right? We're not the governor. We're not in control of where a lot of those decisions are being made. But if we can be people that tell other people within our community how to help, I think that's a positive thing. And a lot of us did that. So from a constituent service standpoint, that has been what we've been doing the last 11 or 12 weeks or so.
Now, earlier this week on Tuesday, the Senate and the House passed a concurrent resolution. What would that resolution do?
Yeah, so the initial resolution by the House was passed a couple of weeks ago. It was an amended resolution that partially ended the shutdown. And then the Senate took it up yesterday and re-amended it and made it so that it completely took away the shutdown. And what do I mean by that? What the resolutions do within the statute that the governor is using to have his ability to do an emergency order, there's a provision that says by concurrent resolution, if the House and Senate pass one saying that the emergency order must end, then the governor effectively has to issue another order, a subsequent order saying the emergency order is over. So it's a check on the governor's power so that he's not the only one that has any say-so. The representatives of this state in the Senate and the House, we are the consent of the governed. There's buy-in for the rule of law because everybody has a say in the laws that are governing over them through their elected officials. And that's what we do. We are lawmakers. Our function constitutionally is to make law. The governor's function is to apply law and enforce law. And a collective decision was made by the House and Senate that the emergency powers have been extended too far. They've been too draconian, and the time is ripe for us to go back to standard order. And the issues that are still outstanding as it relates to this pandemic, we could fix them legislatively, and we can do that effectively. We've shown it, and that was the decision that was made. I applaud the decision. To be honest with you, I think it was a little bit late, actually, but I understand I'm one of 203, and it's a large state, and what's happening on the eastern side of the state is much different than what's happening on the western side of the state.
Now, if the governor were to veto this resolution or ignore it altogether, would the business shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders still continue in the state, or what would happen? So
right now we are in a novel constitutional crisis, and it's from a legal standpoint people's livelihoods that are at stake here. But from a legal standpoint, my inclination is that the governor will do one of two things. He'll veto it, and force litigation that way, or he will go and seek an emergency injunction, preventing it from basically going into effect and letting it litigate that way. My take is that we are going to end up in litigation over the issue. There's a lot of lawyers that I've heard that I respect on both sides of this issue. And if you read the Supreme Court case even that came down, and the DeVito case just a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago, there's some interesting language there that might indicate where some judges might fall. And I don't think anything is really set on this at all. And that's one of the reasons why we did wait the time we did. We said, let's see if we can work collaboratively with the governor. We tried passing bundles of different legislation to reopen certain segments of the economy, to use different metrics as far as the reopening process, because we didn't want our constituents or the state or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to basically have their livelihoods caught up in this constitutional crisis between the executive and legislative branch, and caught up in litigation. And the bottom line is legislators were elected to make laws. The governor was elected to administer laws, and we need to get back the standard form that we've shown that we can do it quickly. We've shown that we can do it effectively, and it's just we need to be ready to go forward and get back to some resemblance of normalcy as it relates to our foundational institutions and how we operate. The rule of 13, or the rule of 1 over 13 million has got to come to an end.
And one final question for you. If this resolution were to come into effect, if the shutdown orders were to cease here in Pennsylvania, what would that mean for Pennsylvania businesses as well as Pennsylvania citizens?
Well, immediately it would mean that the orders and the power that the governor had to issue those orders would be gone. So effective immediately, it would end up sending us back into some level of normalcy, right? Although there's still guidelines coming out from the federal government. There's still recommendations that would be highly encouraged. But that's what would happen in the immediate future. And then and also keep in mind, there's also other jurisdictions at play here, particularly with counties that have their own Department of Health and the larger counties in the southeastern portion of the state as well. I believe that once we figure this out, and if that were to happen and it were to be ultimately revoked, after litigation, it gets to that point, because I do think there's going to be a pause on this until the litigation gets done. I hope not, but I do think. But either way, once we get to the point where there's some clarity, the legislature is going to have to be in a position to act and act swiftly, and we will be, because there might be some things that we need to do legally, and we need to show and prove to our constituents that we can be that consent for them, and also do it in an efficient and quick manner that addresses the crisis that's left at hand.
Representative Josh Kail, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Join our guests for insights on issues impacting local government and the citizens of Pennsylvania. Created by the Pennsylvania State Association of Boroughs, Inside Pennsylvania Boroughs connects you to legislation and policy that will affect you and your family. Your host, Chris Kapp, and his guests discuss current affairs that matter to you most. Connect with your state by tuning into Inside Pennsylvania Boroughs on Sundays here on PCN.
I'm here with Gary Eichelberger. He is the chairman of the Cumberland County Commissioners. Now, Gary, as the chairman of the commissioners in Cumberland County, how has COVID-19 changed the way that you and your fellow commissioners do your job?
Yeah, we actually, as a board of commissioners, we're essentially the governing board for the county government. So, we have to look at this thing through several different perspectives. Number one is we are a significant employer in Cumberland County, so we're facing many of the same challenges that that other employers are facing in terms of we have a large workforce, and we have to figure out whether they're going to continue working, if they're going to continue working, how we make that effective and still practice things such as social distancing, et cetera. So we had to address, we're a 1,300 employee organization. So we have to look at it through that perspective. We're also a primary provider of human services. In fact, many of the counties act as the state's agent for local provision of things like drug and alcohol and mental health issues, mental health services, and children and youth. So these are areas that have their own ramifications that they're facing as a result of COVID. So we don't have the option of just shutting those things down, even if we're shutting down the government, so to speak. So we have to address the continuity of operations. How do we keep providing those essential services that in many ways are actually needed more now than they were before? So we have to look at it through that perspective. We also have different community partnerships that we are involved in our role. So we're also a facilitator of information. In fact, county public safety departments were charged with a lot of the responsibility of daily interaction with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Association and helping push the health department and PEMA information out so that the public knows the correct way to respond to this to protect themselves and to protect others. So we have a number of different perspectives that we are approaching the issue on, and each one of those responses has to be different.
And what are some of the ways that you and your fellow commissioners have worked to help support the people and the businesses that are in your county?
Yeah, in terms of the external audiences, I mean, our primary role still emanates from our information distribution of health-related information. How to social distance? What are the requirements that is part of the emergency? We've also played a role in helping manage the procurement of emergency supplies for other community providers. We're one of the few counties that also maintains our own publicly owned nursing home. So that added a significant layer of much greater complication as well, because we have other nursing homes in the area. They have their hands full just running their operation. We're doing all of the continuity of county government plus running a nursing home on top of that. So it's been very, very consuming, quite frankly, is the word for it from our perspective. We also have in Cumberland County, we have our own Economic Development Corporation, which is a private entity, but it is essentially a creation of the county government and acts as the county's economic development, economic outreach agent. So, and all three commissioners sit on the board of that organization. So a big part of our role is also helping our Economic Development Corporation work with area businesses in terms of qualifying for state and federal relief dollars and now recovery dollars. So that part of the job is just really beginning to spin up now as the CARES money and other federal dollars and other state grant dollars begin to come online.
Now, let's go back to the very beginning of this year when COVID-19 was first coming to the state and Pennsylvania received stay-at-home orders. So when Cumberland County first got those orders from the governor, what were your first thoughts? What was your first reaction to that?
Yeah, I think we more or less expected that was coming through soon because it was pretty evident that the country was in general moving towards something of a shutdown mode. To the extent that you can nothing really totally shuts down, especially as I explained before, in county government. The need for our services actually increased in some areas. So we had to adopt our internal operations. We did eventually go through a significant furlough of county employees, first time that Cumberland County's ever gone through that. So we, unlike some counties, we didn't have a ready-made plan for downsizing. We had to invent that as we went. So we automatically turned toward the first rule of the day is compliance. We have to comply with keeping people at home and yet providing our service. And the people who are here, we have to exercise social distancing. We have to implement all new practices in terms of sanitization. We have a building that has a great deal of foot traffic from the public. We have a number of offices that provide over-the-counter services. Those would now be shut to the public. So we had to determine, do those services just go into hibernation or do we find alternative ways to provide the service? And in some cases, we could. We also have the courts here. The courts are a major part of what we do. And of course, the Constitution requires speedy resolution for those who are who are participants, shall we say, in the criminal justice situation. You can't just lock people up and leave them there. So we had to ensure that there was some continuity of operations for courts on an ongoing basis. So we had to find new ways of doing that. We had to work very closely with the county court system because they're autonomous. We have the separation of powers. So we have to forge a working partnership with them in terms of how to do that and how to still keep people safe. And we have to come to agreement on that. And that's not always an easy thing, quite frankly. You have the county government run by the commissioners. You have independent law officers. You have the judges who are independently elected and who have their own way of doing things, to put it mildly. And so we had to come to working cooperation. So we went into full collaboration mode to try to find services, how to provide services and keep that going. We did not have the luxury of simply bringing things to a halt.
Now, not only did COVID-19 have an effect on county government and the government facilities there, it also had an effect on businesses in the county.
Yeah.
So what were some of the biggest concerns that you were hearing from those businesses and those business owners?
Well, obviously, we hear the same things that every other municipal entity heard from, and it was, how am I going to make up for lost revenue if I close my doors? What if my employees don't come to work? Or if they're ordered to stay at home, how can I keep my organization solvent? There's a reason they call it a going concern. You got to keep going. And we had a lot of concern here across the county from our business sector. And we are predominantly a small business county. And of course, the smalls typically are more vulnerable to this type of thing. They don't necessarily operate with large capital reserves, and they're just more vulnerable and have that much more deeper concern of what they can fall back on. And of course, the banks that they rely on are extremely reluctant to in a mass situation. This is not like one business going to the bank saying, "Hey, I need help with meeting these payments." The banks were being hit full on from every business, asking for the same thing. Now, what was important to this is that you had the federal government stepping in, the Federal Reserve stepping in, the state government stepping in. So this was truly a multi-tiered, multi-leveled crisis and a multi-tiered, multi-leveled solution that was needed. And I would say the degree of collaboration between the various branches of government and levels of government was absolutely essential to getting us to at least be able to hang in there and to help our businesses hang in there. And of course, there was the payroll protection was offered early on. There was some small business administration lending that became available. All of those were extremely important, but also inadequate. So there have been, of course, a number of other programs proposed and agreed upon that are out there now. So the response of the government continues to roll and evolve as the economic downstream effect rolls through the economy as well. So our role was different at the beginning of this. It's evolving and it's changing. And of course, now we like to think that we're almost fully into recovery mode. We still have mitigation concerns, but recovery mode is a really different animal. And we have the CARES money. We're waiting for guidance yet from the state. We were expecting that a few days ago, but we're still waiting on that. And we hope to have that in hand soon. That will help us begin putting money out there in terms of not only our businesses, but some of these other sources that will help with nursing homes and hospitals and a number of the other organizations that are in need of financial assistance.
Now, on June 12th, which is this Friday at the time of recording, Cumberland County will be going green in Governor Wolf's reopening plan. What does that entail exactly?
Well, we were elated when we were able to move to yellow, and of course, yellow is still highly restrictive, and green is significantly better. It's still somewhat better. It is not the end of the journey, as many people seem to think it is, or as I've been telling people, it's not easy being green. So you still have a lot of requirements you have to meet. But it certainly does loosen the requirements, the restrictions, to a degree that with some adaptation, our businesses really should have a fighting chance now to start getting back to normal. And it's probably important to understand for everyone that this is not like an air raid where the all clear sounds and now things go back to normal. This is in phases. This is a gradual process. It will be hard to say on what day we're going to wake up and finally say, oh yeah, things are back to normal. It's going to happen in a way that it just kind of dawns on us all in our own good time. So we have significant loosening of things. It's certainly going to help our retailers, and they're a big part of what we do here. We're hoping that travel resumes. It's a big factor for us economically. We have, of course, one of our premier things that goes on economically in our county is the series of automobile shows, car shows that are produced here in Carlisle, which is our county seat. And right now, I mean, that's typically, those shows generally have somewhere between 20 and 30,000 attendees. Now, even under green, we have a restriction that groups are limited to 250 people. So that creates quite a problem for anyone who has, an event, a special event of that nature. And of course, they have to be able to, their people come from all over the nation for this. It's a big economic driver for Cumberland County. So we're anxious to see that it happens, but we're also anxious to see that it happens in a way that doesn't harm our public. So we know, for instance, that they are working very diligently to get a waiver to that 250 head count limit currently. Not sure where that stands just yet, but that's going to be really important because that's a company that their business is seasonal, and if they have no revenue coming in for a season, that goes directly to the solvency, their survivability, and that's an economic driver that could be lost to us, not just for 1 year, but in perpetuity. So we certainly want to be working closely with the state government so that they understand that if we believe we can still meet all the requirements, for instance, with the car shows and still protect public health and still hold the event. But each case is individual, each case is unique, and the governor's hearing a lot of these right now. We certainly are trying to get our message through that the folks at Carlisle Productions have been very diligent in planning to provide a safe event. Now we have to get the state government to see that.
Gary Eichelberger, thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you.